Chapter 4. Jeff had sent Melody a scarf for Christmas, a green silk scarf painted over with pinks and golds and oranges, like a garden. She would have to write him a thank you note for that, he thought. But that wasn't why he'd sent it. He sent it so that he would be perfect in his love. They didn't celebrate Christmas at their house, not with a tree or stockings or lots of presents. They never had, Jeff guessed, since he couldn't remember any Christmases, even from when he was young. Usually, the professor got him a present, a book. He'd gotten a fire engine one year, he remembered, with a ladder that went up and down. Since they'd been alone together, Jeff always got a present for his father, too. A book about wines, or a new and fancy corkscrew, or a key case. This year he'd gotten his father a belt, because the professor's old one had cracked and worn where the leather had been too often rubbed. Jeff couldn't remember what he'd given his father last year, or what he'd been given. But the present for Melody felt to him like no other present he'd ever given or gotten. He knew it was perfect and perfectly beautiful. He thought about how much she would like it. When he thought like that, happiness swelled up warm within him. On Christmas morning, Jeff brought down the box for his father when he came to make breakfast. Usually on vacation days they ate breakfast and lunch whenever they felt like it, because the professor often worked late and slept late, but on Christmas Day they ate all 3 meals together. Jeff put his box, gift-wrapped by the store, at his father's place. When he heard the professor stir upstairs, going into the bathroom for his morning shower, Jeff started to cook sausage links and broke eggs into a bowl. When everything was ready, he called up. The professor, dressed, his white hair damp on his head, came to the table empty-handed. He unwrapped his present silently and thanked Jeff, then ate his breakfast slowly. Jeff didn't mind not getting a present, but he was worried that his father might mind having forgotten. He wondered if he should say something to the professor, to reassure him. He wondered if he could remember next year that they weren't exchanging presents anymore. He ate as slowly as the professor and wondered if Melody had opened her scarf yet. The professor cleared their plates from the table and poured himself a second cup of coffee. "Well," he said, "Merry Christmas." He sounded uncomfortable, and he stood uncomfortably beside the stove, holding his coffee mug awkwardly. Jeff tried to think how to say to the professor that he didn't care about not getting a present, when his father abruptly left the room. Before Jeff had time to figure out, listening to the footsteps in the hall, going down to the study, if his professor was angry or what, the professor returned, carrying a large flat box across his arms. He had wrapped the box around with red tissue paper. "Merry Christmas," he said again, still uncomfortable. He put the box on Jeff's lap. He took his mug and sat down to watch Jeff. Jeff looked at the flat box and then at his father. His father's discomfort was catching. "Thank you?" he said. "It's not a book," he observed. The professor leaned his elbows on the table. An uneasy smile moved at his mouth just a little. "Open it." Puzzled by his father's strange move, Jeff did. He took the paper off carefully, then pried up one end of the cardboard box. As soon as he saw the smooth, curved strip of wood, he knew it was a guitar. He pulled it gently out of the box. A Martin, and one of the old ones. He put it across his lap and laid his hands on it, touching it. The 6 steel strings stretched taut up over the belly and along the fretted neck. The frets and tuners glowed, their metal worn to a deep shine by age and by use. Jeff ran his fingers all around its outlines, its deep curves, its straight lines. He plucked at low E and heard the mellow, clear reverberation of a perfect note. He looked up at his father across the table. "It's an old one," he said. Then his voice choked and he swallowed. "May I be excused?" he asked quickly. He didn't wait for an answer because he could feel tears swelling up behind his eyes. He left the kitchen hastily. Halfway up the stairs he remembered and turned back. He put his face just through the doorway. His father had been staring into the coffee mug, his face expressionless. "Thank you," Jeff said. "Thank you," he said again. His voice sounded steady, but emotions pushed up behind his eyes as he repeated his thanks, and he rushed down the hall. The professor didn't like tears and emotions, and it would be a rotten way to show how much he liked the guitar to throw all that emotion at the professor, to show how he was feeling. And he was feeling. Jeff sat on his bed and hugged him, just hugging himself. He didn't know what he was feeling. It wasn't just happiness because it hurt him. It didn't hurt anywhere in particular. but as if he wasn't large enough to hold the feeling and still he had to hold it. It was as if something he wanted so badly he didn't even dare to notice how he wanted it, because he couldn't ever have it, had come to him, just fallen out of the sky. He didn't deserve it. He couldn't understand how it happened now to be his. He couldn't even think. He could just feel. Jeff got a pick and sat down again, holding the martin. He put his fingers on the strings and started to play. He played a simple progression, A, D, E, and the perfect sound brought tears to his eyes again. He waited, then played again, the song that reminded him most of Melody. On a wagon bound for market sits a calf with a mournful eye. After a few minutes he found his voice to sing it. He played and sang the few songs he knew over and over. At last he realized how hungry he was and went downstairs, where he discovered it was well past lunchtime. The professor emerged from his study to stand in the kitchen doorway, while Jeff hurriedly ate a peanut butter sandwich and gulped a glass of milk, impatient to get back to the martin. The professor looked like he wanted to say something, so Jeff waited. Music rang inside his head. "If you'd rather have a new one," the professor said, "there's no trouble. I'd rather you have what you want." Jeff felt laughter rising in him, and he let it ride through him. The last thing he wanted was a new martin, not with his solid gold old one, made in better days by better craftsmen. His father's ignorance in suggesting that made him laugh. A clear bubble of happiness made him laugh. The professor's eyes flickered once, and his face didn't change. He nodded once briefly and walked away. Jeff heard the study door close behind him. Shaking his head, smiling to himself, he swallowed down the rest of the milk. He rinsed out the glass, then washed it and set it upside down on the rack to dry. He capped the peanut butter jar and put it away. He washed the knife he had used, but the flicker in his father's eyes had looked like hurt feelings. Jeff stopped smiling. But that was ridiculous. The professor didn't fool around with feelings. They weren't a part of his life. But what if Jeff had gotten the greatest present anyone could have given him, and the professor thought he didn't like it? But he'd said thank you. Melody would have understood, he thought impatiently. But what if the professor didn't? Jeff moved thoughtfully down the hallway and stood before the closed door. He shouldn't, he knew, interrupt his father at work. But he really didn't want the man to misunderstand, because after all, the professor knew nothing about guitars. Jeff knocked on the door. "Yes?" So Jeff opened it and went in. The professor sat at his desk in the middle of the room facing the door, working on a pile of papers. "I'm sorry," Jeff said. He stepped into the room. One step, then stopped. "Don't worry about it. It doesn't make any difference. We can go back tomorrow so you can pick out the right one," the professor said. "You really don't understand, because it's the best present anyone could give me." Jeff hurried the words out because his throat was choking up again. "The old martins they're wonderful. The way they sound, much better than the new ones. I didn't expect anything like that." To his horror, tears were in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he apologized again. "I don't mean to be emotional at you. I just like it so much." His father looked at him. "Thank you for taking the trouble to make that clear." Jeff heard the humor in that, and a little laugh came up through his choked throat. "Yes, sir," he said, smiling back, leaving the room, returning to his martin. By the end of the afternoon, calloused as they were, his fingertips throbbed. He had learned, among other things, that he was much more limited than this instrument. He wanted to learn more chords, more songs, more strums. He wished the stores were open so he could rush out and buy a couple of instructional books. For Christmas dinner, Jeff roasted a chicken, made stuffing from a mix, cooked a package of frozen peas. He poured out a glass of white wine from the carafe in the refrigerator and called his father to dinner. They sat down in silence, and Jeff carved. The professor couldn't carve a chicken without hacking it into unrecognizable, unappetizing slabs. When the professor carved, the chicken looked as if it had been torn apart by some inner explosion. "Not much of a Christmas dinner, is it?" the professor said. Jeff was surprised. It had been years since he had thought about that. "We never do much for Christmas," he reminded his father. "We never did." "That's true, but I wonder if we should have." "I don't see why," Jeff told him. "It doesn't make any difference." "You know," the professor said, lifting a bit of breast meat to his mouth, "I don't think I ever realized that there's a lot of your mother in you." Jeff didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry," he said, apologizing for the tears yet again. "When she first loved me," the professor said thoughtfully, without expression, "when she loved me, it felt as if I had swallowed sunlight, like the sun was rising inside of me." Jeff just stared at his father. "I've never felt so helpless before or since. Happy, too." "Then why did you get a divorce?" Jeff asked. "We're not divorced," the professor told him. "But what I mean to communicate to you, however clumsily, is that you should not be sorry to be like her. She had a way of knowing how I was feeling. I don't know how she did that." He returned his attention to his plate. Jeff watched him for a minute before lifting his own fork again. "You know, I never call you anything." He didn't look up. The calm voice answered, "Thomas noticed that years ago. I'm not the daddy type, or pop. I can understand your difficulty." Jeff looked up. "When you think of me, do you call me anything? More than just he?" "Yeah, Professor," Jeff answered with a grin. His father chewed. "Yes, that would do." Jeff thought it might. "Yes, sir," he said, then tried it out. "Yes, Professor." "Yes, that would do fine. And Professor," he said. His father lifted his eyes again, chewing without speaking. "The Martin is perfect. I can't ever thank you enough." "Good," the professor said. "That's what I hoped. That it would be perfect, that is. Not that you would feel bound by everlasting gratitude." Brother Thomas never came to see them on Christmas Day, because it was a holy day. Instead, they had a special dinner on the day after Christmas. This year, he made them veal marengo. "A ragout, not a stew," he told Jeff as he cut the veal roast up into chunks with mushrooms and tomatoes, a little wine, and the peel of an orange. "Why don't you bring down that famous guitar of yours and give me a little musical background while I labor here?" Jeff hesitated. He'd never played for anybody. "I'm not very good," he said. "I don't mind. Do you?" "Well," Jeff said, "do you want to be better? Do you plan to be?" "Sure." "Then what's the harm?" So Jeff brought the Martin down and played on it. Brother Thomas seemed to be listening at most with only half his attention, so Jeff forgot he had an audience. When it was time to set the table, Brother Thomas made his assessment. "You're not very good now, but I'll be surprised if you don't turn out to be quite good. Do you want to call the professor?" Jeff was pleasantly surprised. It turned out to be an evening of surprises, because Brother Thomas told them, as they sat full over empty plates, that he was going to England for a year to study at Oxford. He beamed at them. "Can you imagine it? The dreaming spires and me and the dreaming spires." "I'm very happy for you," the professor said. "You must be pleased to have won the grant." "Pleased, that's an understatement. This is Tommy Richardson from Peroa, whose father worked in an assembly line. The unsuccessful son, not the black sheep among the children, but certainly the maverick. You've been there, Horace, but I never thought I ever would." Jeff looked up. His father had been to Oxford? Brother Thomas had been a kid named Tommy, whose brothers and sisters did better than he did? "When do you leave?" the professor asked. "In a couple of weeks, which means I have to ask a favor." "What's that?" "Could you two give a home to my stereo while I'm away? The books and pictures all boxed, but the stereo, I'd like it to be used. It's better if it's in use. We could keep it in the living room." "You could play it," Brother Thomas said. "There's room at the back of the kitchen there, just as long as you keep the cover on when you're cooking. It's about the only room in the house with any space. Anyway, thanks. And then, if you'd come over during the summer—" Jeff looked at the professor. He didn't want to make any plans for the summer. His father smiled, shaking his head. "We can't possibly afford it. You know that. We can barely afford to live the way we do." "Don't be such a stick in the mud, Horace," Brother Thomas insisted. "Your salary isn't that bad. Your expenses can't be that much. What you've got a mortgage at least 10 years old, so the rates aren't high. But I had to borrow for the down payment, too, from the university. I'm still paying that off as well, with interest. And then there were the bills Melody had run up, and she'd borrow some money so she could make big donations big enough to do some good. She wanted to. I've pretty near cleared those away now, but there's the school, too, and living expenses. We don't have any savings, Thomas. I'm really sorry. We just don't have the money." "I thought you didn't have to pay for me," Jeff asked. "That went out when you were in 4th grade. "I'm sorry," Jeff said. "It didn't make any real difference," the professor said. It wasn't just the tuition. It was also uniforms, books, supplies, lab fees, Jeff knew. He felt bad because his father's money was being wasted. He wasn't doing very well in school, C's at the best, and somehow, over that first 7th grade semester, he had become a real nobody. He had gone from being nobody much to somebody nobody liked. He wasn't disliked exactly, he was just in the way. It used to be that he was sort of there, on the playground for a soccer game or at his desk in the classroom. Nobody minded him being there, but nobody actually wanted him there. Now, they would just as soon not have him there, not because he was disliked, but because he was in the way, like a fly in the room. You didn't really mind a fly, you just waved it away. You didn't notice when it was gone. Jeff didn't think about school except to dislike the careless tone of voice in which he was told to change his seat or that he wasn't welcome in some game. "Move it, Green," one of the boys would say. Jeff never even bothered looking to see what boy it was in classes, except that he seldom spoke because he heard faint sighs whenever the teacher called on him. It didn't make any difference to him. It didn't make any difference to him away from school. He had the guitar and now the Martin. He had his memory of melody, and nothing could touch him. Jeff wrote to his mother at the first of the month, January, February, March, April, May, and June. He gave up hoping for a response. He did get postcards from Brother Thomas occasionally, pictures of castles or the pages of illustrated manuscripts with an informative message and the signature scrawled at the bottom, Bro T. But for Melody, nothing, not even after Christmas. Jeff didn't let himself think about that. The stereo sat at the back of their kitchen and often poured out music because Brother Thomas had also left his records for them to take care of. Jeff became familiar with names like Mozart and Handel, Bach, Brahms, and Beethoven, Shatowski, with their music, in which Melody song was only a part of it. Out of his allowance, he bought himself a couple of records of people who played guitar and sang, Joan Baez, who reminded him of Melody, Pete Seeger, many of whose songs were familiar to him, Judy Collins. By listening, he learned to mimic some of what they did on the guitar. The Martin could do anything he asked of it. It could do, he knew, more than he asked of it, more than he could yet ask. One day in May, Jeff finally asked his father whether he had any photographs of Melody. "No, I don't," the professor said. "I never needed them. I never had any trouble remembering her." Jeff waited, but he didn't add anything to that. Jeff wondered why Melody had said so confidently that the professor would have pictures, but he didn't ask. Melody's name came up again at the end of the month, again over dinner, but this time because Gambo wrote a letter to the professor saying yes, of course they would have Jeff for the summer, asking when he would arrive. The professor showed Jeff the letter, which was about 2 lines long and signed with an unfamiliar name, Mrs. Beaudrault Melvin. The handwriting looked old, thin, and wobbly. It looked much older than Gambo did, and weak, as if she didn't have the strength to close her O's or lift the pen cleanly off the page to start a new word. "That can't be her name," Jeff said. "Her husband's. She's a widow. I believe her name is Eulalie. Melody called her Gambo. And I never met her. Do you want to go?" "Yes, if it's all right with you. Did you write and ask her?" "Well, I thought you'd want to, and I thought I'd waited long enough for them to contact us. I'll get the plane tickets, unless you want to take the bus." "No," Jeff said quickly. Then he thought, "unless it's a lot cheaper, isn't it?" "Not enough money to make any difference. I think this time I'll ask the airline counter to hold the return ticket for you to pick up, unless you mind that." "Why should I?" "But Professor, how come you never met Gambo?" The professor shrugged. Then he decided to answer, but kept his eyes on the bites of rice he lifted on his fork, kept his face expressionless. "We had a quiet wedding, so she didn't come up for it. Then Melody, when she visited her home, stayed for weeks, and somehow they were always inconvenient weeks. I taught summer courses in those days. We needed the money. And there was you to take care of. Gambo wasn't used to children, not little children. And then his voice drifted away, and he picked up his knife to cut meat off his piece of chicken. "Professor, why did you two separate?" "If it's any of my business," Jeff asked. "I guess it is," the professor said. Jeff knew he hadn't offended his father. "But I don't know how to explain it. Do you know what Tolstoy says?" Jeff just waited. The professor knew perfectly well he had no idea what Tolstoy said. "Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way," the professor told him. "That's an answer?" The professor chuckled. "I must admit," he said. It was all right, Jeff knew. He knew he shared a sense of humor with his father. He hadn't always known that, but he had learned it, and he was going to spend the summer with Melody. "I think," the professor said, arranging his utensils side by side on the plate, "that I was a continual disappointment to your mother, from the beginning. At the beginning, she wanted a particular engagement ring, something like what her grandmother has. I never saw it, but it sounds impressive. It is. I couldn't afford that. Of course, not with the down payment on this house, and she wanted a house, of course, and she didn't want a small diamond. I explained it to her, and she said she understood, but she didn't understand. And she understood less as time went on. She minded it. She was always disappointed. That's the kind of disappointment I mean. And this house wasn't what she wanted either. Jeff heard that the professor didn't want to say any more about it, and since he didn't want to make his father uncomfortable, he didn't ask any questions. "When do you think I can go down there?" he asked instead. "A couple of days after school lets out? Can I take the Martin?" And he was thinking Melody.